All right, today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to step past the daily political headlines and look at the psychology of Donald Trump, using the ideas of Carl Jung as a kind of lens to understand what might really be going on.
Our analysis kicks off with this really powerful, almost ominous line. It suggests that the real story isn't what we're seeing on TV, but something much deeper, something happening inside a system that's under an incredible amount of stress.
And that really raises the central question for us today, doesn't it? We're not just talking about a shift in politics here. We're trying to figure out what this deeper, underlying problem is. Our source frames this as a kind of psychological collapse, one that has very, very real consequences in the world.
So the source uses Texas as a case study. For a long time, it was seen as this impenetrable political fortress for Donald Trump. But now, we're starting to see cracks. You've got protests over the tragic killing of Renee Nicole Good, poll numbers are dipping, and even once loyal allies are starting to hesitate. These are like the small tremors that tell you something much bigger is happening just beneath the surface.
To really make sense of these events, we have to shift our perspective. We need to move from the what, the political moves, the headlines, to the why. And according to this analysis, the key to unlocking that why is through the psychological framework of Carl Jung.
Okay, so let's start with the first big concept, the persona. This is basically the public face we all create. It's the version of ourselves that we want the world to see, right? It's our social mask, the identity we build for everyone else.
But here's where the trouble can start. Jung called it ego inflation. This is what happens when a person's actual self, their ego, completely merges with that public mask. They start to believe they are that perfect, idealized image, and they totally lose any sense of their own human limits.
So according to this analysis, Donald Trump's persona didn't just use power, it became one with it. His identity became totally inseparable from what Jung would call an archetype. And in this case, it's the archetype of the absolute king, a figure who isn't just a leader, but is the living embodiment of victory, of the nation itself.
And this slide, wow, this just nails the core issue. For a healthy leader, a bad poll is feedback. But for an inflated ego, one that believes it is the king, well, it's not just criticism. It feels like a direct attack on your very existence. Opposition isn't just a different opinion. It's felt as a deep betrayal, as persecution.
Now for the next piece of this psychological puzzle, the shadow. This is Jung's word for all the stuff we deny about ourselves. The weaknesses, the fears, the contradictions, all the things we push down into our unconscious, because we just can't stand to look at them. And the source argues that Donald Trump's public life is just a relentless war against his own shadow. So instead of ever acknowledging any weakness inside, those very traits get projected outward. They're aggressively hunted down in political enemies, in the media, in anyone who dares to challenge that public persona.
Okay, so let's look at the hard data from Texas that's acting as the trigger here. A net approval of -6 is one thing, but look at the net approval with Hispanic voters, -38. In this psychological framework, these aren't just numbers. They represent a deep, profound rejection of the persona.
And here's the crucial point. These numbers aren't just processed logically. For an inflated ego, they are powerful, negative symbols. They completely bypass any rational thought and deliver a deep psychological wound, what's often called a narcissistic injury.
So this injury kicks off a really predictable psychological pattern our source calls the escalation loop. The symbolic threat creates a wound. That wound leads to compensation, this urgent need to reassert dominance. And that internal need then explodes externally as increasingly extreme and controlling actions.
This table connects the dots perfectly. Threatening to veto the Affordable Care Act? On the surface, it looks like a policy goal. But the psychological driver? Punishing disloyalty. Demanding voter data? It's framed as election security, but it's really about replacing lost trust with total surveillance. Every action is driven by this powerful internal need to soothe a threatened ego.
And this is where the analysis points to a much broader danger. This isn't just about one person's psychology anymore. When a leader's internal struggles, their fears, their need for control, line up with the fears already present in a society, those patterns can become contagious. They can spread.
But according to our source, that spell is actually starting to weaken. And a key sign is the language people are using. When you have figures from completely different ends of the political spectrum, like Democrat Jasmine Crockett and right-leaning comedian Tim Dillon, and they both start openly talking about things like corruption or incompetence, it signals that the powerful persona is losing its grip. So these are the symbols of that fracturing system. Each one shows the psychological breakdown becoming visible in the real world. The tragic killing of Renee Nicole Good makes abstract policy painfully human. The use of humor, even from the right, shows that the reverence is dying. And the idea that simple government oversight is persecution, that shows you how deeply the personal ego has merged with the state itself.
So where does this all go? Well, the source is crystal clear on this. For an ego built on the idea of total power and constant victory, retreat is simply not an option. To admit a mistake, to show any limitation at all, would feel like a kind of psychological death.
So, if you can't go backwards, what do? The only path forward is to double down. More force, more demands for absolute loyalty, more enemies to blame for everything. Escalation becomes the only way to protect the persona, even as reality itself is pushing back harder and harder.
And this all leads to the source's powerful, chilling summary of this stage. Denial hardens into destiny. The refusal to look at yourself, the constant denial of that shadow self. It doesn't just put off a problem. It actually locks in a destructive course, turning a psychological flaw into an unavoidable fate.
And that leaves us with one final, provocative question. This whole dynamic is a chase, isn't it? It's an ego desperately trying to outrun the parts of itself it just refuses to see. This analysis suggests that race might be nearing its end, and it forces us all to think about what happens in that final confrontation.